My name is Arnold Cartner and I arrived in Port Hedland in 1962. The purpose of my visit was here is to carry out a introduction for the development of iron ore in the Pilbara. The manager at that time was the project manager, Mr. Bill Liddicoat, who met me on my arrival, took me around and showed me a brief run around about Port Hedland, which I might add at this stage was very little here. There was no industry here. The population was approximately 1,000 people. 500 people of those would be Aboriginals, which all worked out on the stations, and very little industry at all in Port Hedland. My first visit to Port Hedland, Mr. Liddicoat announced that as there were several other staff already in employment in Port Hedland, would be a meeting the next day at the office, and he'd go through the procedures and bring me up to date on where the project was at this present moment. Next day I did arrive at the office and had a look through the project and a discussion with Mr. Bill Liddicoat, and I was amazed at the lack of qualification for the project going ahead. There was very little planning being done, completed. There was no licences out. There was no embargo lifted. There was no portal authority being attained at this stage. In other words, we're at bedrock bottom. And it was very disappointing to arrive here and find that they were so low and so slack in their project management. After a period of time, and mentioning all this to Mr. Bill Liddicoat, and he said that they are in the stages of rectifying the anomalies that are all in existence. They had not even decided what port they were going to export the iron ore from. That was a big problem. We were using Dubuque Island, Cape Crorden and Port Hedland, and at this stage nobody made a decision as to what port we were going to use. So we did have a few problems to start with. The next 3 months there was a lot of activity being achieved. The first one I was so pleased was the fact was that they had not lifted the embargo. You can do absolutely nothing if you've got an embargo, and let me be quite frank, the embargo was not only on the iron ore in Port Hedland, it was in Australia-wide entirely. It was a repercussion of the Japanese War, even though it carried on for 4 or 5 years. So the lifting of the embargo was announced publicly outside the post office in the middle of the street, and there was such an enormous amount of frivolity and anxiety that at last Port Hedland was going to come to some reality. But there was a big mistake made when we made the announcement, which was made by the federal government. The lifting of the embargo was the main thing that we were after, but the general public and the general construction people misunderstood the announcement. They thought we were ready to start mining. We had no mining at all here. All we did was to announce that the embargo had been lifted. We could proceed with the plan for mining. We had over 1,000 people arrived in Port Hedland, and they were all people from other mining industries that had finished, and they arrived in cars, caravans. They were even sleeping underneath the wharf down here. It was a disaster to start with, and there was no competition at that stage. In actual fact, the planning had not been even approved by the mines department. So this 1,000-odd people arriving in Port Hedland and making such an enormous difference to the town. It made an enormous difference to our organisation. They come to the fact is that they had better start moving along and get the licences so that we can sell the iron ore, that we can mine the iron ore, we can export the iron ore, and we can start employment of people. Until we got those finished, Port Hedland was a very, very desirous place not to be in. After lifting the embargo, the most important aspect of the whole project was the calling of tenders. We did have 4 or 5 tenders out. We had the most important tender was the calling of a dredge. And you would not believe it, there were 6 applicants from overseas people, and each one had a nil tender document in the envelope. In other words, no one from the whole of the world put a tender in for the dredging of this harbour. Fortunately, our main contracts with Utah Construction and Mining Proprietary Limited had a subsidiary company called Utah Jewelled. Utah Jewelled was a dredging company who at this present stage, or not believe it or not, were in Japan, and they were digging up at Tokyo Harbour in the efforts or not to find a place to, believe it or not, was to bury and store iron ore. That I would not believe until I saw the story. So we mentioned this at a meeting. The whole company, which consisted of Cypress Mines, Utah Mining and Utah Jewelled, they then decided that they would lift the dredge from Tokyo and bring it up to Port Hedland, and remembering the fact that the dredging contract would be for about 2.5 years. So they had to do a deal, which I'm not aware of, but they then arranged for the Utah dredge to release their enormous thing called Alameda, biggest dredge in the world. At one stage it would pump 50 to 60,000 litres of water in one day. So they're the type of things we wanted here. So that eventually did come to fruition. It took them 1 month to transfer the dredge from Japan up to Port Hedland. Unfortunately, when they got to Port Hedland, they had insufficient water for it to get over the harbour. The harbour was dredged up to a point where there was an enormous bar across the entrance to Port Hedland Harbour. And that was when we analysed the tenders. The reason why we had got no tenders, there was no tenders in the world that had equipment that could enforce the content of the harbour at the front. It was such a hard material that they didn't have the material to do it. And that proved the fact that when they got the Alameda into Port Hedland Harbour, they had to wait for enough time for it to get over the material itself. So eventually it got over and it entered the harbour, and then they started their proposal for dredging. At that stage, all proposals were on this table, because they had to read back to who was going to be the winner in getting that material out of the harbour. There was no other dredge in the world that could do it, and the story starts from there. There did appear, after the sad start we had with the Alameda, there was a breath of fresh air when they started doing the dredging. When they first put the Alameda over and they set the cutter dredges in, the cutters would not in and would not take out the material. So we then had to make an application to the mines department for permission to be able to utilise dynamite and do a preliminary blast prior to the dredge coming in and doing the cutting as required under the contract. This was happened, and the arrangements were to made at low tide. The Japanese crew would go in, they'd drill a hole in all the materials, and then in the high tide they would do a blast to loosen or to dimension the material so that it could be lifted out of the harbour. The most amazing part about that was the number of people that you would see that would stand along the front of the riverfront outside the Esplanade Hotel, all occurring there about 10 minutes before high tide, because we had to advertise the date at that time of all the explosives for the people to be aware of it. So they were all sitting along the sides and banks of the Pier Hotel, and as soon as the blast was over and it was all on high tide, as you can imagine, all the fish come up to the top, and the sale of fish that went in the Esplanade Hotel for a carton of beer was amazing. It was a very high trade, so that was one of the byproducts of dredging the harbour. So there was a plus. You can imagine now that you have got the main source of supply in the harbour, and that is the dredge. Because the main thing was the dredging and the material coming out of the harbour that was going to be utilised in the building of facilities, especially on Finnegan Island. When you analyse the amount of work that was going to be done at Finnegan Island, apart from the upgrade of the harbour itself, it was the establishment of a complete residential facility. It was also the establishment of the loading facilities. All of these things, I might add in between time, that all the engineering stuff that come up would mostly come from Germany. And we appointed a German person by the name of Al Kober, who was in charge of all the construction and all the disposal of stuff as it come into the harbour. The Alameda then supplied all the spoil for the building of the causeway, which was a necessity of being able to get onto the causeway, onto the Finnegan Island, because there was no other recess except rowing across from here, across the road there, until we got the causeway in. That was built, and the majority of that fill come from some of the blasting that was done in the harbour, because it was such hard material, and they used that for the foundation for the causeway as they went off the mainland onto Finnegan Island. The next thing we had to then analyse was that we had 100 kilometres of railway to be built from Finnegan Island to Goldsworthy itself, which incurred the crossing of the De Grey Bridge, which had to be built, and also the railway line also had to be built. Under the establishment, it would take a certain time, and the advertising went out for the railway workers, and they were very poorly received. So we contacted the Torres Strait Islanders, and we done a deal with the Torres Strait Islanders, which some of them are still here today, and we chartered a flight with 70 Thursday Islanders over, and we brought them all over. They then took the contract starting at either end. One started at Finnegan Island end and then went that way, and the other one started at Goldsworthy and worked towards the centre. So that expedited the finish of the railways. But I might mention there that it's another little humorous episode too that I got caught in myself. I was out there one afternoon and just checking on them because there was a competition between some Thursday Islanders and some Aboriginal workers all working on the railway line together. And the Thursday Islanders said to me one day, he says, "Hey Arnold, come and have a look at this." And he saw that, he says, "Look at those picks," he said, they're laying on the ground. And I said, "Yeah, well, what's wrong with that?" He said, "Well, that's not fair." And I said, "What do you mean it's not fair?" He said, "When we go and take our break, this morning tea or lunch, said, we always get our picks and put them that way into the sand." He said, "But those other fellas, they're very shrewd." He says, "They lay them on top of the sand." And I said, "What's wrong with that?" He says, "You watch when they come back to work. So that when they all come back, they have to stand upright and get the heat out of the picks so before they could use them." So they lost a certain amount of time, whereby the Thursday Islanders were about 3 or 4 kilometres ahead of the others because the others were too hot. They couldn't handle the crowbars. So that was a little lesson that I said, "Well, when you stop learning, you stop living." So that was another little instance that did happen. They had a tremendous job in them because they started from nothing. And their contribution to the community was something that I was amazed at, that having 80 Thursday Islanders people coming into an organisation and going into camps and things like that, they were such tremendous contributors to the people themselves. And if they had a hangi or something of that nature, they'd always make sure that people from the community were invited along there to be part and parcel of their celebrations. And that had wonderful relationship in that whole running of that railway line, to the effect that as soon as they finished the railway line for Port Hedland, they then took on the World Championship when they built the railway line between Port Hedland and Newman. That railway history still exists today. It was a world record. So that was the railway line, a wonderful success. The other one that was a hidden one that not too much of us saw was Goldsworthy. Goldsworthy started from nothing. absolutely nothing. And then they had to have 600 people there. They established the railway facility. That's all their workshop, all their maintenance were all established out there. And once again, it was another part in the history of Goldsworthy that everybody became involved in it. Even the kids had jobs. I used to go out there and watch the big dome. The big dome was their central point where everybody loved it. It was a real classical place. And even little kids were working down there. They used to employ them picking up the rubbish and going around cleaning bins and things like that. And in my estimation, when I was out there, I only lived out there for a little while because I had a family in town. But they just made it their own home, and the combination of everybody out there was great. And the workload out there was tremendous because all their railways were maintained out there. They had to do the continual coming and going. And then the ones that you don't see much about, and I didn't see too much about it, was the building of the railway line and the bridge went across the De Grey. A very, very big attempt to do it. And the Thursday Islanders did assist in it, but the majority of that was done by the major contracts, Utah Construction, because they had the major contract for the whole lot. So that was the establishment of Goldsworthy, the dome, the railway line and the crossings, all done by about 2 or 3 contracts, all main contractors under Utah Construction Mining. And that was a very successful job, and they finished a little above time. Then, of course, I remember that when we did sell our iron ore, we had to have a time limit of when they wanted it. So after 2.5 years, the information come in from the Japanese and said, we will be sending in the Harvey S. Mudd. We wish to load our first load out, which will be in the vicinity of 25,000 tonne of our first shipment of iron ore we'd like taken out on the 26th of June, 1966. And everybody had a meeting and says, can we meet the deadline? And yes, they had enough iron ore to be able to do it. Unfortunately, prior to the loading of the ship, we had a cyclone called Shirley. Shirley arrived, and about a week before the Alameda come in, but she couldn't berth because some of the jetty itself had been damaged, and that had to be repaired, and that took about 11 days. It did before they could put the ship in. So it stayed at anchor for 11 days, and then they brought it in for the celebration day, and they had the full celebration done. We arranged for the Japanese to come over here. Sir David Brand, who was the Premier of Western Australia, was to be the officiator, and we had that wonderful man called Mr. Jet Monks, who was an employee of the Port Authority, brought the ship in under adverse conditions and berthed it, and also waited for it to finish. So all the celebrations, everything went off pretty well, and we didn't have any problems as far as once we got the ship loaded, and away they went. When I stood there at the end of the loading, and most of the frivolity and everything else had quieted down, I looked out and I saw the ship going out to sea. And as it was going out to sea, I thought to myself, what a wonderful vision this is. Look at this ship going out to sea now. What is the future of the town of Port Hedland and the state of mind? And that's when I termed it the hub of the Pilbara iron ore industry. And that's what I said to myself, this is not only a vision now, it's a reality.